Good day, everybody. This is CIGS Foreign Policy and National Security TV. Today, again, we have a great guest from Stanford, Mr. Dan Snyder, son of Dick Snyder, who was the U.S. diplomat in the early 70s. He was stationed in Tokyo. And my father-in-law negotiated with Dick Snyder, your father. So what a coincidence that it's great to have you today, Dan. And you are also bureau chief of Christian Science Monitor in Moscow, and you saw the Soviet Union. And how do you rate? Today's topic is the strategic implication of the war in Ukraine for Northeast Asia or East Asia or Indo-Pacific in general. So what's your take on Putin's strategic decision or mistake or whatever, disaster? What do you think? Is it not pretty understandable?
Well, so first of all, I like to point out, aside from the time I spent in Moscow in the former Soviet Union, which included the collapse of the Soviet Union, so it was a dramatic time. So you saw it? That was my probably the greatest assignment any journalist could ever want. My eldest son, who was born when I was in Moscow, spent 7 or 8 years as a correspondent for The Economist. He's now in Tokyo as a bureau chief, but he was a correspondent for The Economist in Moscow and Kiev, and he covered the early phases of the war in 2013 and 2014. And I've been going back and forth to Russia during all this period as well, including several trips to the Russian Far East. So I've been very engaged with Russia all during this period. Okay. I think almost with few exceptions, when we saw the buildup of Russian forces, the belief was that there would not be a full-scale war and a full-scale invasion, that Putin would use that as an instrument of pressure in order to gain more limited objectives, mainly to seize more of the eastern part of Ukraine and what's called the land bridge that protects access to Crimea. And so people were shocked, and I was also shocked.
You were shocked too?
I did not see that coming because I thought it was, I think we had this image of Putin as being this very rational, calculating, ruthless, but calculating leader. And if you watched him, listened to him, this is an intelligent man. He's no sort of bombastic personality, very, very careful, as he should have been as a former KGB agent.
But you think he made a mistake?
He made a huge strategic error.
Right.
Partly, I think this is a product of two things. One is his growing sense of, I think, perception of American weakness, or his belief in American weakness, and that flows in part frankly, from the Iraq War and the disaster of the Iraq War. So Putin's rhetoric about the West and about the United States really started to shift around 2007. And I think that's linked to that. And then, of course, comes the Lehman crisis in 2008, the sort of perception of America in retreat, if you will, from its sort of foreign wars.
What about the fall of Kabul?
Well, I think so we have the two things, very important things. One is the 2008 crisis in Georgia, where in response to the threat to bring Georgia into NATO, Putin basically went to war with Georgia, and there was no consequences. They seized parts of Georgia, and nothing much happened. Then comes the seizure of Crimea, 2013, 2014. Again, the West basically, so they impose sanctions, but there's no real consequences, and there's a kind of a sense that the West, the United States, NATO, conceded the idea that this should be Russian territory and that this is Russia's sphere of influence. And you get this rhetoric that you hear a lot of from very prominent people that this is a legitimate expression of Russian response to the threat of NATO expansion.
So you're saying that Washington might have sent the wrong signal?
I think they did. And then I think it's compounded by a very important thing, which is two things. One is that Putin always wanted to take control of Ukraine. And the Maidan uprising was a crucial event. And Putin's, even after Zelensky came into office, there was a moment where Putin maybe thought he could basically get control of the Ukrainian government. That's always been the Russian goal, but that failed. So I think then he began to think about basically seizing Ukraine in toto. And he made a huge mistake in his assessment of the Ukrainian people themselves and their willingness to resist. He really never understood that Ukrainian nationalism really was the barrier. And the Ukrainian desire to be part of the West, which was manifest there. So that's one big mistake, big miscalculation, which we saw because he had this plan that he thought he could take Ukraine in 3 days. Second thing is, Putin was very isolated within Russia. So, and ironically, some of that has to do with the COVID epidemic, because Putin is got a pathological fear of disease. We don't really know why exactly. Maybe he has some medical problems, but he sealed himself off. People, even at the most senior level, Russian senior officials had to go into quarantine for 2 weeks before they could see him. And we've seen these images of these huge long tables.
Long tables.
So he had cut himself off even from those members of his own inner circle of advisors, many of whom apparently opposed this idea. Plus, the flow of intelligence to him was narrowed to just those people who were telling him what he wanted to hear. So these were huge mistakes, and I think it's interesting that he wanted to secure the Chinese backing for this. He went to Beijing at the time of the Winter Olympics, February of last year.
And issued a joint statement.
And they issued a joint statement. It's not clear that he told the Chinese what he was going to do either. There's some, and I think the Biden administration picked that up, and they were briefing the Chinese on what they knew were Russian war plans. Chinese didn't apparently believe them, but I think that
but they wanted Putin to avoid the period of Winter Olympic Games.
Yeah, well, he did that. He waited for them, absolutely.
Right.
So for him, securing the support of China was crucial. So I think that in some sense, it's not only the strategic miscalculation of Putin we're looking at, it's the strategic miscalculation of Xi Jinping.
Right.
And
I agree.
Therefore, the outcome of this war has huge implications, not only for what happens to Russia and what happens to Ukraine, obviously, but what happens to China.
Exactly. So that means what kind of negative impact or what kind of implication? I want to go into details. What if the war continues? Because I don't think that it will end soon, I'm afraid to say. So what if war goes on for another year or two? What would happen to Russia, Ukraine, and China and Taiwan? What do you think?
Well, I'm probably a little bit of an outlier on this, in that I know there are a lot of people who worry that this is a war that will stagnate into an extended conflict with no resolution. And we have the interesting comparison with the Korean War.
Right.
I mean, are we going to end up, and the Korean War is an interesting comparison in other respects, because that was also a case where Stalin and Mao both made a huge miscalculation, a similar one, because they thought the United States wouldn't respond, wouldn't intervene. And in the same way that they perceived the United States as being distracted by Europe, in retreat, if you will. So they misread the global situation, and the same way that I think Putin misread Biden and the NATO response. So that's a parallel, but I think, the one fear is that we end up in a kind of armistice in place. and then we have a conflict that goes on forever, like the Korean conflict in some sense has. I don't think that's going to happen.
No? Why not?
I think the dynamic of this war, I'm not a military person, but I am a historian of sorts. I don't think this war is going to stabilize. I think we're looking at the next months through the spring and summer into the fall, which is sort of the peak of the fighting period, if you will, because of the questions of snow and freeze and so on, which affects movement of particularly armor. I think this is going to be crucial. We're either going to get a clear Ukrainian victory on the battlefield, not necessarily a total victory, but something along the lines particularly of driving the Russians back in the east and cutting the land bridge, which I think is their goal, because they want to isolate Crimea. That's a situation where then the Russians really have to think about whether to negotiate seriously an end to the war. Or alternatively, the Russians could prevail. I don't see that happening because I don't see the Russian military is rotten. It's rotten in the way that authoritarian regimes sometimes are. They have a command structure where people don't know how to lead. They don't know how to take leadership at the lower levels. They're corrupt, and the corruption is seeped into the even the equipment that they have. You know, the things were supposedly being built that don't exist. Modern tanks that they showed off, but they can't produce them. And I think the Russian population is, in some sense, a passive supporter of this war.
Passive, but they are very patient people as well.
They are.
And they're, correct me if I'm wrong, they may have some kind of inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West. And that will make them more sort of supportive of whatever dictator
well,
they may
I think
have.
Putin has had to go from, at the beginning of this war, was we're fighting to denazify Ukraine. So we're fighting fascists in Ukraine. Then they were losing. The fascists in Ukraine are gone. They don't talk about them anymore. So now it's not a war. They have to explain to the Russian people how is it they're losing against, Ukrainians. If you've lived in the former Soviet Union, you know that there's a kind of a sort of Russian imagery of Ukrainians. Russians always felt superior to Ukrainians. They were kind of the little brothers, but they were also sort of peasants, not so, not as smart and as capable as Russians. And here we see Ukrainians, in fact, are brilliant tacticians. They've absorbed the use of technology. They fight with an intensity that the Russian troops are not able to match. So now the formula is, no, we're not fighting Ukrainians, we're fighting the West.
Oh.
They're only winning because the West we're really fighting a war against NATO. And you've watched Russian television and the really sometimes just almost bizarre propaganda that appears in Russian television. It's now transformed into a war against the West.
Putin is making the war more and more unwinnable.
Yeah, and it's harder for him to retreat. So I think...
What would happen next? Within the next several months?
Well, one possibility is that some part of the Russian elite, and this is sort of a deus ex machina out, that people are an ramp, by the way, out of war that people think about but don't necessarily count on. Some part of the Russian elite says, enough, we're destroying the country, including the economy, even though they've managed to survive somewhat, and someone takes care of the problem at the top. Look, this is a culture where that's happened.
So it's not the popular movement, but rather internal sort of power struggle among the elites?
I think so, because the level of repression within Russia and the passivity doesn't mean that the Russian population are enthusiastic participants in this war, but they're not going to oppose it. And I think it's too ruthless a regime for most people to take that risk. We have seen almost 1 million Russians leave the country and this is some of them, a lot of them are the sort of the best and the brightest of Russia, the IT technicians and the intellectuals and others.
Many have left already, I was told.
They're gone. They've left. So that damage will reverberate. So, but it also means you don't have the people who are going to lead a revolution inside the country. So I think that's not going to happen. I mean, one could hope, but I don't think it's going to happen. So I don't say, I'm not trying to be too Pollyanna-ish about, a quick solution to this. And we could be in a long conflict. If we're in a long conflict, of course, then the issue becomes, what's the strength of the Western NATO and, frankly, Japan and other allies who've really responded tremendously to this challenge.
Yeah, before we discuss our response, I just want to ask you how China sees the situation and what will be the best option for China. I mean, vis-a-vis this war. The Americans are now worried about Chinese sending lethal weapons or more formidable military equipment to Russia. Do you think China would cross the red line and support the Russians to...
I hope not, and I think the Chinese leadership has received the message loud and clear that, frankly, that decision, a decision basically by the Chinese to rescue Putin and rescue the Russians, I think it leads us to the brink of World War III. I say that in all seriousness. I mean, because the natural response to that is that we are going to have to directly intervene, by we I mean NATO and the United States and our allies, into the war in a way we haven't done. And all the dangers of escalation, including the use of nuclear weapons, will be on the table. So this is a very portentous moment for the world and for the Chinese leadership. They have to decide what world do they want to live in. If Xi Jinping's, the problem is Xi Jinping's commitment to Putin and frankly his sort of sense of comradeship, if you will, with Putin, so deep that he's going to go down this road, then he's endangering, frankly, everything the Chinese Communist Party has built in particularly the last 30 or 40 years.
Well, but Putin did something similar. And I always, tell my audience these days that the most important lesson we learn from Ukraine is that dictators make mistakes.
Yes.
And absolute dictators make more stupid mistakes, and those mistakes may not be easily corrected.
Well, and they make bigger mistakes because there's no flow of information to them.
Right. That's true. So if Putin could do it, so why not Xi Jinping?
I think the Chinese regime, although I think Xi Jinping has really destroyed to some degree some of the elements of collective leadership that did exist in the Chinese Communist Party. But still, there's probably more flow of information within China than maybe within Russia. I can't speak to that with any degree of real certainty. I do know from my limited conversations with Chinese policymakers and intellectuals who've managed to make their way out of China. There's a lot of sense that this was a huge mistake on the part of Xi Jinping. And it's combined with other mistakes, the reversion to Maoist style.
Are they aware of those?
Yeah, they talk about it.
To you?
When they're not in China. Yes.
When they are not in China.
Yeah.
I see. Well, before we come to an end, why don't we talk about the U.S. policy? Because you may have more insights. My understanding is that the U.S. foreign policy first priority is, of course, China. And Russia is in decline, but China is still on the rise, and probably in the longer run, China would be a formidable challenger. So, but you have to deal with the Russians now, and if they mishandle the war in Ukraine, then that could spill over. So, what the Washington has in mind at this particular moment? There are many sort of people involved, and the Russia hands are involved, European hands are involved, and then Asia hands are also involved. What do you think? What's happening in Washington now?
I think we're lucky that Joe Biden is the president of the United States. So, first of all, we're lucky we don't have an isolationist like Donald Trump and that part of the Republican Party, which basically wants to retreat from the world. So Biden is an old-style Cold Warrior.
Yes.
And I think the primary foundation of his foreign policy is not confrontation with China. It's alliance centrality.
I see.
I mean, the big thing he needed to do, and he did it, was to rebuild the alliance system in Asia and in Europe. And I think the war in Ukraine has been a test of that commitment to alliances. And I think they've managed this very well, because it's been difficult. There are different, interests involved here. Europe is a complicated place. The Germans have a difficult relationship with the Russians, but I think it's been managed extremely well. The degree of coordination with NATO and the involvement of Japan and Korea and Australia, our partners in Asia, with NATO, growing involvement with NATO. This is a huge achievement, and I think I think the framing of this struggle as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, that may strike some people as being a little bit presumptuous and maybe hypocritical, since Americans have, had a history of interventionism. But I think more importantly, the underlying issue is you cannot, the challenge to the post-war international order comes from the use of force to alter boundaries and seize territory.
I understand
That's
that.
a fundamental issue, and we saw it, frankly, in the first Gulf War. So this is not new, and that's different from the second war in Iraq. And I think that's why Japan has responded so strongly, because I think Japanese saw what a challenge this is to the system, the status quo, if you will, of the system on which Japan has prospered itself. So I think those are the real values that are underlying this. And then dealing with the Chinese, in some sense, is a much more complicated issue. I think we understand the Chinese are challenging the status quo.
Right.
But I think we also still want China to reach the conclusion that they need to return to the global system and abandon the idea that they can reorder it to their ends. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know, but I think there's still an attempt to reach out and to basically say to the Chinese, hey, your own prosperity, your own future really depends upon this international system in which you are a participant so far. Russians, in some sense, have never been a major participant in this system.
No.
Except as an oil and gas producer.
Well, I hope what you said is going to happen, but unfortunately, probably the dictators may not listen to your reasonable suggestions or advices, I'm afraid to say.
Even authoritarian regimes have to seek some type of consent and support from their populations. You can use the instrument of repression to keep them in line, but the Chinese Communist Party had a bargain with the Chinese people. You be quiet, you don't make trouble politically, and we deliver to you rising living standards and the ability, after all, to go out into the world, Chinese tourists everywhere, enjoying all those things. If they cannot deliver that part of the bargain, and there are some signs that they're having trouble doing that, then it's a problem for them.
Well, Thank you, Dan Schneider, a good friend of mine. He's going home soon via, I think, Korea, but he's now writing a book. And I cannot go into details because he's still writing, but it's going to be a very interesting book. I can guarantee you. It's about the Okinawa reversion negotiations. Is that?
So your father-in-law and my father and some other really wonderful people negotiated the reversion of Okinawa.
Right.
And before that, my father and very famous Japanese diplomat, Mr. Togo Fumihiko, they were the drafters of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, the Revision Treaty. So the two, I think, fundamental documents that form the basis of our alliance, the Security Treaty and the Reversion of Okinawa, they were in the middle of those, and I'm going to tell that story. And it's a wonderful story of diplomacy, of alliances, of managing those alliances, and frankly, of two peoples who fought a major war with each other,
right,
and managed out of that war to create an incredible friendship. I think that's one of the great success stories of the entire post-war period.
When are you going to publish it?
I hope next year.
Okay, next year.
Well,
a long way
the publishing business is a slow boat.
I see.
Very slow boat.
In the meantime, let's. I'd like to thank Dan Schneider once again for coming here and sharing your wisdom and insights. Well, CIGS Foreign Policy and National Security TV will continue to focus on those important issues, and I hope that you will come back to us with better appreciation with the viewers' registrations. Well, Dan, thank you very much for coming, and bon voyage.
Thank you.
I look forward to your wonderful book.
As always, a great conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.